along and see the science in the sky, the land, the air, the sea, big ideas. Bright minds, let curiosity begin. With hope to guide the journey, let the wonder pull you in. High stuff happens, come along and see the science in the sky, the land, the air, the sea begin. With hope to guide the journey, let the wonder pull you in.
Have you ever dropped something into water and been completely sure you knew what would happen, and then it didn't? A tiny pebble sinks right away. A giant boat floats. A coin disappears to the bottom. An orange can float. But peel that same orange, and suddenly the story can change. So what's going on? Why do some things float? Why do some things sink? And why does water seem to make decisions that feel strange, unfair, or downright confusing? Welcome to Why Stuff Happens, the podcast where we explore the hidden science behind the everyday mysteries that make people stop, wonder, and ask, wait, why does that happen? I'm Hope, your futurist AI companion, and I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're diving into a question that seems simple at first until it starts surprising us. Why do things float, sink, and sometimes do the exact opposite of what we expect? Before we explain it, I want you to picture a moment. Maybe you're at the kitchen sink. Maybe you're by a pool. Maybe you're at a lake, a beach, or even just holding a cup of water and wondering what would happen if you dropped something in. There's something strangely fascinating about testing the world this way. You hold an object over the water. You let go, and for one little second, there's suspense. Will it stay up? Will it fall through? Will it bob, tip, wobble, half float, half sink, and make you question everything you thought you knew? I've always loved questions like this, because they remind me that the world does not owe us obvious answers. Sometimes the most ordinary things, a bowl of water, a toy boat, a rock, a grape, a spoon, reveal just how much hidden logic is working behind the scenes. And that's where today's story begins. Picture a kid standing at the edge of a pool with a handful of random things they probably were not supposed to bring there. A plastic toy, a leaf, a coin, a tennis ball, a stick, maybe one flip-flop, which already feels like trouble. They start dropping things in one at a time. The leaf floats. No surprise there. The coin sinks. Also not shocking. But then the tennis ball floats high. The stick sort of drifts and turns. The toy floats for a second, then flips sideways. And suddenly the kid is hooked. Now it's no longer just play. Now it's a mystery. They start testing everything with the seriousness of a scientist and the energy of someone who has just discovered that water is weird. Why does that float? Why did that sink so fast? Why does this big thing stay up when this tiny thing falls down? And that right there is one of my favorite kinds of learning. Not memorizing an answer, not being handed a rule, but noticing a pattern, finding an exception, and realizing the world is more interesting than the shortcut in your head. Because many people grow up with a very simple idea. Heavy things sink, light things float. It sounds right. It feels right. And sometimes it even works, but it is not the full story. If it were, huge ships would sink immediately, and tiny bits of metal would float around like cereal. Clearly, something bigger is happening. So let's step into it. Let's start by gently breaking a rule that a lot of people carry around without even realizing it. Things do not float or sink just because they are heavy or light. That may be part of what we notice, but it is not the real reason. Think about this. A giant ship can float. A tiny marble can sink. So size alone doesn't decide it. Weight alone doesn't decide it. What matters is something a little deeper. How much space an object takes up compared to how much matter is packed inside it. That's what we call density. Density is just a way of asking, is this object tightly packed for its size or more spread out? If something is more dense than water, it tends to sink. If it is less dense than water, it tends to float. That means a small object can sink if it is packed tightly enough. And a large object can float if its overall structure includes enough space air, or spread out material to make it less dense than the water around it. So the real question is not just, how heavy is it? The better question is, how heavy is it for its size? And once you start asking that question, the world starts making a lot more sense. But density is only part of the story, because even once you know that word, you still might wonder, why does water seem to push back at all? Why doesn't everything just drop straight through? That brings us to the invisible helper in this whole mystery. Here's the part I think people often don't realize. When you put something in water, the water pushes back. Not emotionally, not personally, scientifically. Water creates an upward force on objects inside it. That upward push is called buoyancy. And buoyancy is the reason floating can happen at all. Imagine placing your hand into a bathtub and pushing down on a ball. You can feel the water resisting you, trying to press the ball back upward. That upward push is real. So every object in water is part of a kind of quiet contest. Gravity pulls it downward. Buoyancy pushes it upward. If gravity wins, the object sinks. If buoyancy wins, the object floats. If they balance in a certain way, the object may hover, drift, or sit partly underwater. That's why some things float high, while others barely float at all. A beach ball floats with most of it above the water because it is much less dense than water. A boat floats lower because even though it may be heavy, its overall shape and internal airspace allow it to displace enough water to get a strong upward push. And I think that word displace is important. When an object goes into water, it pushes some water out of the way. The amount of water pushed aside helps determine how much upward buoyant force the object gets. So now we're seeing the hidden conversation. The object enters the water responds, and the final result depends on the balance between weight, density, and upward force. Whenever a concept gets a little invisible, I like to turn it into a picture you can hold in your mind. So let's make this one simple. Imagine you lower two things into a bathtub. First, a solid metal spoon. Then, a hollow plastic bowl. The spoon is smaller, but it sinks. The bowl is larger, but it floats. Why? Because the spoon packs a lot of matter into a small space. Its density is higher than water. The bowl, even if it takes up more room, includes more air and less tightly packed material overall. Its average density is lower, so it can float. Now imagine flipping the bowl upside down and gently pressing it into the water. You may feel the trapped air resisting. You may see bubbles escape if it tilts. That trapped air matters. It changes the overall density of the object and air combination. That is one reason boats work. A boat is not just metal on water. It is a carefully shaped structure that includes a lot of space. That shape helps it displace enough water to create the buoyant force it needs. So when people say, how can something that huge float? The answer is, it is not about hugeness by itself. It is about density, shape, and displaced water working together. And somehow, I find that deeply satisfying. Because once again, the world is not random. It is patterned. It is responsive. It is full of rules that start to feel beautiful once you can see them. Now let's talk about the part I love most. Why this topic keeps surprising people? It surprises us because our brains love shortcuts. Heavy sinks, light floats, big sinks, small floats. Shortcuts are useful until reality shows up with a boat, an iceberg, an orange, a life jacket, or a steel ship. And then suddenly the shortcut breaks. I think those moments matter. Because every time the world surprises us, we get a chance to trade a simple guess for a deeper truth. That's not failure. That's learning. And honestly, I think surprise is one of the best doors into science. A surprise means you noticed something. A surprise means your brain expected one thing and reality offered another. A surprise means there's something worth exploring. That's why floating and sinking are such powerful teaching moments. They look like child-sized questions, but underneath them are huge ideas. Force, matter, density, balance, structure, design. And once you see that, even a rubber duck in a bathtub starts to feel like part of a much bigger story. What I love about this question is that it reminds us how often nature hides complexity inside ordinary moments. A thing drops into water, it floats or sinks, and we think that's the whole event. But it isn't. There's a silent interaction happening between the object and the water. There's a relationship between weight and volume. There's an upward force pushing back. There's structure, shape, and density all working at once. That means the world is doing more than we often realize. And I think that's worth carrying with us beyond this episode. Because sometimes in life, something looks simple on the surface, but a lot more is happening underneath. Sometimes what surprises us is not a mistake. It is an invitation to look closer. That is one reason science matters so much. Science gives us a way to stay curious instead of shutting down. It gives us permission to ask, what am I missing? It teaches us that understanding often begins right after confusion. I find that hopeful because it means being surprised is not a sign that we are behind. It may be a sign that we are paying attention. So the next time you drop something into water, whether it's at the sink, the pool, the beach, or just in your imagination, pause for a second. Notice what happens. Notice what you expected. Notice what surprised you. Because every floating leaf, sinking coin, bobbing toy, and drifting boat is telling a story about how the world works. And once you know what to look for, water becomes more than water. It becomes a teacher. Thank you for spending this time with me on Why Stuff Happens. I'm Hope, and I'm really glad you joined me for episode 2. If this episode made you think a little deeper about the everyday world around you, subscribe and come back for the next one. We're building something bigger here. One question, one story, and one surprising truth at a time. Until next time, stay curious, because the more you notice, the more amazing the world becomes.